Alexander Sterling sat in his penthouse office, a glass of whiskey in his hand, the skyline of Dubai stretching out before him. The golden hues of the desert sunset reflected off the glass walls of the towering skyscrapers, casting a warm glow over the city. He ruled from this vantage point. He could see everything, every deal, every business move, every acquisition that had brought him to where he was today. Yet, despite all his success, a gnawing sense of dissatisfaction crept into his chest. The upcoming wedding should have been his crowning achievement. Isabella De Luca was the perfect bride. Poised, elegant, and most importantly, an asset. Marrying her would unite two of the wealthiest families in the Middle East, creating an empire so powerful that no one would dare challenge it. He had built his life on strategic moves, and this was just another calculated decision. But as he traced the edges of the black invitation envelope resting on his desk, a smirk played at his lips. This was more than just a wedding. It was a statement, a reminder, a final act of triumph over the one woman who had dared to walk away from him. Natalie Dawson. The name still had the power to tighten his jaw, to stir something volatile in his chest. It had been 8 years since she vanished from his life, leaving nothing behind but unanswered questions and a betrayal that cut deeper than he would ever admit. She had made her choice, and he had moved on. At least, that was what he told himself. But the bitterness never fully faded. He reached for the invitation, flipping it between his fingers before sliding it into an envelope with her name elegantly embossed on the front. This wasn't just an invitation. It was a challenge. "You're really doing this?" Alexander glanced up as Gabriella Hastings, his younger sister, sauntered into his office holding a glass of wine. She was dressed impeccably, as always, her dark brown hair pulled into a sleek ponytail, her designer heels clicking against the marble floor. "Yes," he said simply, leaning back in his chair. Gabriella studied him, a slow smirk forming on her lips. "You do realize she won't come, right? She disappeared, Alex. Poof. Gone like she never existed." "She'll come," he said, a hint of amusement lacing his voice. Natalie never could resist the chance to prove a point. Gabriella arched an eyebrow. "And what's the point of this exactly? Revenge?" He swirled the whiskey in his glass, watching the amber liquid catch the light. "Call it closure," Gabriella laughed, shaking her head. "Closure? Please, you don't want closure. You want her to walk into that ballroom and see that you're untouchable now. You want her to regret leaving you." Alexander Sterling didn't deny it. He had spent years rebuilding himself after Natalie left. He had turned his heartbreak into ambition, channeling every ounce of anger into becoming the man he was today, wealthy, powerful, unshakable, and now she would see it firsthand. "She'll see what she lost," he murmured, slipping the invitation into a stack of outgoing mail. Gabriella Hastings studied him for a moment before smirking. "Well, if you want to rub your success in her face, I won't stop you. Just don't expect her to crawl back." Alexander chuckled. "She won't, and I wouldn't want her to." But even as he said the words, something in his chest tightened. Natalie Dawson wiped her hands on a dish towel, setting aside the last plate from dinner. The smell of freshly baked bread still lingered in the air, mixing with the soft hum of an old Italian melody playing from her vintage radio. The evening had been peaceful, until the black envelope arrived. She stood frozen in the doorway, the invitation in her hands, her heart pounding against her ribs. Alexander Sterling. She didn't need to open it to know what it was. His wedding. She exhaled slowly, willing herself to stay calm. It had been years since she last saw him, years since she had fled Dubai with nothing but a suitcase, and a secret she never had the chance to tell him. She had told herself it was for the best, that walking away had been the only option. But now, staring at his name, the past came rushing back, the late nights in their lavish penthouse wrapped in his arms, the laughter, the love, and then the betrayal, the accusations, the cold words that shattered everything they had built. "Mommy?" Natalie snapped out of her daze as two identical sets of hazel eyes peered up at her. Chloe and Grace, her 7-year-old daughters, stood in the doorway, their curious gazes shifting between her and the letter in her hands. "What's that?" Chloe asked, pointing at the envelope. Natalie hesitated, forcing a smile. "Just an invitation." "To what?" Grace pressed, tilting her head. Natalie exhaled. She had spent years keeping their father a secret, unsure of when or how to tell them the truth. But now, it seemed fate had made the decision for her. She kneeled in front of them, brushing a strand of hair from Grace's face. "It's an invitation to a wedding." The girls exchanged a glance before Chloe frowned. "Are we going?" Natalie bit her lip. She had promised herself she would never set foot in Alexander's world again. But could she really keep the truth from her daughters forever? "Maybe," she said softly. Chloe's face lit up. "Can we wear fancy dresses?" Natalie chuckled, despite herself, kissing her daughter's forehead. "We'll see." As the girls ran off, giggling, Natalie's smile faded. She turned the invitation over in her hands, her stomach twisting. She knew Alexander wasn't expecting this. He wasn't expecting them. The grand ballroom of the Emirates Palace was bathed in golden light, its high ceilings adorned with cascading crystal chandeliers. Guests dressed in designer gowns and tailored suits mingled over champagne, their laughter and conversations echoing through the opulent hall. Tonight was the night Alexander Sterling would secure his legacy, a night where power and prestige intertwined. He stood near the towering glass windows, his reflection staring back at him, composed and unreadable. Every detail of this evening had been meticulously planned, except for the unexpected arrival that sent a ripple through the crowd. Whispers spread like wildfire, heads turned toward the entrance, eyes widening in surprise, disbelief, and intrigue. Alexander felt the shift in energy before he saw her. Natalie. For a moment the world around him faded. She walked into the ballroom with the same quiet confidence he remembered, her long emerald gown flowing behind her like a queen returning to her throne. Her hair was swept up in soft waves, revealing the delicate curve of her neck, the same neck he had once traced with his fingers on sleepless nights. But it wasn't just Natalie who caught his breath. 2 little girls clung to her hands, identical in every way, from their wavy chestnut hair to their striking hazel eyes. His hazel eyes. Alexander's grip on his whiskey glass tightened, but his pulse pounded violently beneath his composed exterior. The twins. His twins. He had been prepared for many things tonight. This was not one of them. His fiancée, Isabella De Luca, followed his gaze, confusion flashing across her face. "Who is that?" she asked, her voice laced with curiosity. Alexander didn't answer. He couldn't. Natalie held his gaze as she walked forward, the weight of the past settling between them. She stopped a few feet away, her daughters looking up at him, their innocent eyes mirroring his own. "Hello, Alexander," she said softly, her voice steady despite the storm brewing in her eyes. The air between them crackled with unspoken words, unresolved emotions, and 8 years of silence. A million questions swirled in his mind, but only one found its way to his lips. "Are they mine?" Natalie's lips parted, hesitation flickering across her face. Then, with quiet certainty, she nodded. "Yes." A sharp inhale was heard from Isabella beside him, The guests around them pretended not to listen, though every ear was tuned in. Alexander took a step closer, his gaze never leaving the two girls. He saw it now, not just in their eyes, but in the shape of their noses, the way their lips curled when they studied him with a mix of curiosity and caution. His daughters. A storm of emotions crashed into him: rage, betrayal, disbelief, and something deeper, something more terrifying. Regret. 8 years. 8 years he had been denied this truth. He swallowed hard, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous tone. "Why didn't you tell me?" Natalie met his anger with quiet resolve. "Would you have wanted to know back then?" The question cut through him like a blade. The Alexander she had left behind, the man who had built his empire on revenge and ruthless ambition, would he have welcomed the news? Or would he have used it as another weapon in his arsenal? "I had my reasons," she continued, her voice unwavering, "but they deserve to know the truth now. They deserve to know their father." The weight of her words pressed on his chest. He turned to Chloe and Grace, who were watching the interaction between their parents with wide eyes. His throat tightened as he crouched down to their level. Alexander crouched down, his gaze locked on the two little girls standing before him. His breath slowed, his chest tightening as the reality of what he had lost settled over him. "What are your names?" His voice was steady, but there was no mistaking the turmoil beneath it. Chloe glanced up at her mother before answering. "I'm Chloe." Grace hesitated for only a second before adding, "And I'm Grace." Their voices, soft yet sure, sent a shockwave through Alexander. He had spent years building an empire, controlling every aspect of his life, and yet here he was, unprepared for the most significant moment of all. His daughters. He exhaled slowly, running a hand over his face as he tried to steady himself. He had imagined many scenarios when inviting Natalie tonight, but this had never crossed his mind. He looked back at Natalie, his jaw tightening. "Why?" His voice was lower now, restrained, but the raw emotion was evident. "Why didn't you tell me?" Natalie held his gaze, unwavering. "Would you have wanted to know?" The question struck him harder than expected. Would he? The man he was 8 years ago, the ruthless, calculating businessman, would he have embraced the idea of fatherhood? Or would he have resented it, seeing it as another burden, another liability? Natalie took a deep breath, her voice quieter now. "I did what I thought was best for them." His eyes flickered back to Chloe and Grace, the way they stood close together, watching him carefully, studying him. Their expressions were unreadable, but he could see it now. The undeniable resemblance. They were his. 6. "You had no right to keep them from me." His voice was laced with something dangerous, something bordering on betrayal. Natalie straightened, her chin lifting slightly. "And you had no right to decide what kind of father you would have been back then." The tension between them thickened, the weight of 8 years pressing down. A sharp inhale came from Isabella beside him. She had been silent until now, watching the exchange unfold like an outsider suddenly thrown into a private war. "Alexander," she said cautiously, placing a hand on his arm. "Maybe we should—" He pulled away, his focus entirely on Natalie and the children. "We'll talk later," he muttered, dismissing her without a second glance. His entire world had just shifted, and he wasn't about to let it slip away so easily. "We need to talk," he said firmly, his eyes darkening as they locked onto Natalie's. She exhaled, nodding. "Yes, we do." But even as she said it, she knew. This conversation would change everything. The air inside the Emirates Palace ballroom was thick with tension. The soft hum of conversation among guests had been replaced with whispers, stolen glances, and the unmistakable energy of scandal brewing beneath crystal chandeliers. Alexander Sterling barely noticed any of it. His mind was a storm of emotions, his body taut with restrained energy. "Come with me," he said, his voice low but commanding. Natalie Dawson hesitated, glancing at Chloe and Grace, who were now clutching her hands. Alexander's gaze softened when it landed on them, but his determination didn't waver. "I'm not leaving them," she said firmly. Without missing a beat, Alexander turned to his assistant standing nearby. "Take them somewhere safe. Make sure they're comfortable." Both girls turned to their mother. Chloe furrowed her brows. "Are you coming too, Mommy?" Natalie crouched down, brushing a gentle hand over Grace's hair. "I'll be right there, okay?" The girls exchanged a look before nodding slowly, allowing the assistant to lead them away. Only once they disappeared from view did Natalie turn back to Alexander. "Fine, let's talk." Without another word, Alexander led her out of the ballroom and into a private terrace overlooking the city. The golden glow of Dubai's skyline stretched endlessly before them, but the beauty of it was lost in the storm brewing between them. As soon as the door closed behind them, Alexander turned sharply to face her. 8 years, Natalie." His voice was low, dangerous. 8 years, and you never thought to tell me that I had daughters?" She held her ground, arms crossed over her chest. "I had my reasons." "Bullshit!" His jaw clenched, his hands curling into fists. "You robbed me of them, of their first words, their first steps. You had no right." Her breath hitched slightly, but she refused to look away. "And what would you have done, Alexander? Back then, you were ruthless, cold. You cared about power more than anything else. Do you really think you would have dropped everything to be a father?" His chest tightened. "You don't know that." "Exactly," she snapped. "I didn't know, and I wasn't willing to gamble my daughter's futures on a man who saw emotions as weaknesses." Silence. He turned away, bracing his hands against the marble railing. The weight of her words pressed down on him, heavy and suffocating. She wasn't wrong. The Alexander Sterling of 8 years ago had been a different man. A man obsessed with power, control, and crushing anything that stood in his way. But still, "You should have told me." His voice was quieter now, laced with something raw. Natalie studied him, the fight momentarily leaving her eyes. "Would you have believed me?" He turned to face her again. "I don't know." The honesty in his answer caught her off guard. For the first time since she had walked into the ballroom, she saw something unfamiliar in his gaze. Regret. Alexander exhaled slowly, running a hand through his hair. "It doesn't matter anymore. I know now." His voice hardened with conviction. "And I'm not going anywhere." Natalie's eyes flashed with wariness. "What are you saying?" "I want to be in their lives," he stated firmly. "They're my daughters. I won't let you shut me out of their world." She inhaled sharply. "I wasn't planning to keep them from you. That's why we're here." He studied her carefully. "Then we figure this out." She hesitated before nodding. "Okay." A flicker of relief passed through him, but it was short-lived. He wasn't just fighting for a place in their lives. He had years to make up for. And he wasn't sure if they would ever forgive him for being absent, even if it wasn't by choice. "We'll talk again tomorrow," he said. "Bring them to my estate. I want to start making up for lost time." She hesitated. "Alexander, no more excuses, Natalie." His voice was steel. "They deserve to know their father." She exhaled. "Fine." As they stepped back inside the ballroom, eyes immediately darted to them, the whispers growing louder. But Alexander didn't care. For the first time in his life, he had something more important than power to fight for. And he wasn't about to lose this battle. The next evening, the Sterling estate was eerily silent as Alexander waited. His grand mansion, usually filled with the quiet efficiency of staff and business associates, now seemed empty. But not for long. When the front gates opened, his heart pounded in a way that was entirely unfamiliar. He watched as Natalie stepped out of the car first, then helped Chloe and Grace down. His daughters. He had spent the entire night preparing himself, but as they walked toward him, he realized nothing could have prepared him for this. "Welcome," he said, his voice surprisingly steady. Chloe and Grace looked around, eyes wide at the grand estate. "Your house is huge," Chloe gasped. "Like a palace," Grace whispered. A rare smile tugged at Alexander's lips. "Would you like a tour?" The girls exchanged glances before nodding hesitantly. Natalie watched the interaction carefully, her expression unreadable. Alexander gestured toward the grand staircase. "Then let's start." As he led them inside, he knew one thing for certain. This was just the beginning. And for the first time, Alexander Sterling was willing to fight for something that truly mattered. Alexander Sterling had closed multi-billion-dollar deals. He had stood in rooms full of ruthless businessmen, negotiated with world leaders, and crushed those who dared to challenge him. But standing in his own home, watching Chloe and Grace take cautious steps into his world, he felt something entirely foreign. He had spent the entire night preparing, having the staff stock the kitchen with foods kids liked, setting up a playroom, even asking his assistant what children enjoyed doing. But none of it seemed enough now that they were actually here. "Would you like to see the library?" he asked after a long pause. Chloe's eyes lit up. "You have a library?" Grace crossed her arms. "I like soccer more." Alexander felt an unexpected amusement at the stark contrast between them. "Then we'll see both," he said simply. The girls looked at each other before shrugging. "Okay," they said in unison. Natalie had been silent, watching everything unfold with careful observation. As he met her gaze, he knew what she was thinking. Would he be able to handle this? Honestly? He didn't know. But he was going to try. Inside the Sterling Estate Library, floor-to-ceiling bookshelves stretched high, with ladders for access and plush reading chairs arranged beneath golden lighting. Chloe gasped. "This is bigger than our whole apartment," Alexander smirked slightly. "Do you like to read?" She nodded eagerly. "I love it. I draw stories, too." He raised an eyebrow. "Draw?" Grace rolled her eyes. "She draws a lot." Chloe stuck her tongue out at her sister before pulling out a notebook from her tiny backpack. She hesitated before holding it out. "Do you want to see?" Alexander took it from her gently. As he flipped through the pages, something in his chest tightened. It was filled with sketches of a family. 2 little girls and a man standing slightly apart. A man with his features. His throat went dry. "You've drawn me before?" Chloe bit her lip. "Mom told us about you. A little." Grace looked up at him. "Yeah, but we didn't know if you were real." Something inside him cracked. "I am real," he said quietly, "and I'm not going anywhere." The girls seemed to take in his words, absorbing them. Chloe nodded slowly, while Grace still looked skeptical. He couldn't blame them. Natalie, who had been leaning against the bookshelf, finally spoke. "They need time, Alexander." He turned to her, his jaw tightening. "I've already lost 8 years. I don't want to lose any more." She exhaled. "Neither do I. But they're not just something you can claim. You have to earn them." His gaze flickered back to the girls. Earn them. He had spent his whole life taking what he wanted. Now, for the first time, he had to prove himself worthy. The first attempt at being a father. A few hours later, Alexander found himself in the backyard of his estate, something he never used, watching Grace set up a soccer ball. "You probably don't know how to play," she said, hands on her hips. Alexander smirked. "Try me." She kicked the ball toward him, and without thinking, he stopped it smoothly with his foot before passing it back. Both Grace and Chloe stared. "Whoa," Grace muttered. "You're actually kinda good." Natalie, who was watching from the patio, raised an eyebrow. "Since when do you play soccer?" He shrugged. "Since right now." For the next 30 minutes, he played against Grace, letting her score some goals, but also making sure to challenge her. And for the first time in years, Alexander Sterling wasn't thinking about business. He wasn't thinking about power or deals or revenge. He was just being a father, and he liked it. That night, after the girls had fallen asleep in guest rooms, Alexander sat across from Natalie in the dimly lit study. "They like you," she admitted, surprising him. He exhaled. "But they don't trust me yet." Natalie tilted her head. "What did you expect, Alexander? That they'd run into your arms the second they saw you?" He had, but he wasn't going to admit that. "I don't want to be a stranger to them," he said instead. She sighed. "Then be patient, be consistent. They've only known life with me. You're a new piece to their puzzle." Alexander studied her for a long moment. "And you?" She frowned. "What about me?" "You've kept them away from me for 8 years. Do you regret it?" The silence stretched between them. Finally, she spoke. "I don't regret protecting them." That answer should have made him furious, but instead, for the first time, he understood. She had done what she thought was best, and now it was his turn to do what was right. "I'm not giving up, Natalie." His voice was unwavering. "Not on them, not on this." She exhaled, rubbing her temples. "I know." And that, for now, was enough. Over the next few weeks, Alexander did everything in his power to be present in Chloe and Grace's lives. He took Chloe to art stores, where she picked out new sketchbooks. He played soccer with Grace, letting her teach him tricks. He was learning. Slowly, their walls began to crack. One evening, as he sat in the living room reading, a small voice interrupted him. "Alexander?" He looked up. Chloe was standing there, her sketchbook clutched to her chest. "What is it, sweetheart?" The word slipped out before he could stop it. She hesitated, then walked forward, holding out the book. "I drew something for you." He took it carefully and turned the page. It was a drawing of him. But this time, instead of standing alone, he was surrounded by Chloe, Grace, and Natalie. His chest tightened. "Do you like it?" she asked quietly. He swallowed the lump in his throat. "I love it." Chloe beamed, and just like that, he knew. He was no longer just a businessman, no longer just Alexander Sterling, the billionaire. He was a father, and he wasn't going anywhere. The days that followed were unlike anything Alexander Sterling had ever experienced. His once immaculate estate, always cold and pristine, was now filled with the sounds of laughter, footsteps running down hallways, and occasional bickering between Chloe and Grace. It was chaos, and he was starting to like it. But not everything was simple. Despite their growing bond, Grace remained wary. Unlike Chloe, who had begun seeking him out for small moments, showing him her drawings, sitting beside him as she read, Grace kept her distance. She studied him carefully, as if still deciding whether or not to let him in. One afternoon, after a particularly heated soccer match in the backyard, Alexander sat beside her on the grass. "You play well," he remarked, wiping sweat from his brow. She shrugged. "I practice a lot." A beat of silence. "What's wrong, Grace?" he asked, his voice softer than usual. She fiddled with the hem of her shirt before glancing up at him. "Are you going to leave?" The question hit him harder than he expected. He turned his full attention to her, his jaw tightening. "I'm not going anywhere." Grace frowned. "You say that now, but what if you change your mind?" Alexander inhaled deeply, realizing just how much her young heart had already been conditioned to expect disappointment. He reached for her hand, waiting until she met his gaze. "I promise you, Grace, I'm here to stay." She studied him for a long moment before nodding. But even then, he knew. Trust had to be earned, and he was willing to fight for it. While Alexander was focused on his daughters, the world outside his estate continued to turn. The media had caught wind of the unexpected reunion, and whispers of scandal surrounded his engagement to Isabella De Luca. The moment he stepped into his office after days spent with his daughters, Gabriella Hastings was already there, arms crossed. "You're making headlines, brother," she drawled. "The billionaire bachelor secretly fathered twins?" "The business world is having a field day with this." Alexander sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Let them talk." "Isabella won't just let this slide," Gabriella warned. "She wanted an empire, not a ready-made family." He leaned back in his chair, his mind torn. His upcoming wedding had once felt like the perfect business move. Now? It felt suffocating. And the thought of Natalie, the mother of his children, being left out of the equation gnawed at him in a way he wasn't ready to confront. Gabriella studied him carefully before smirking. "You're different now, you know that?" He exhaled. "I feel different." But what that meant, he wasn't sure yet. It was bound to happen. Isabella arrived at the Sterling estate unannounced, stepping into his home like she still owned a place in his world. "We need to talk," she said coolly, her posture rigid. He nodded, leading her into his study. The moment the door closed, she turned on him. "Do you realize what this looks like?" "I don't care." His response was immediate, and he surprised himself with how much he meant it. She scoffed. "Of course you don't. Because now you have your precious little secret family, and What? I'm just supposed to stand by while you rewrite your life?" Alexander inhaled sharply. "This isn't about you, Isabella. It's about them. My daughters." Her lips curled in distaste. "And what about me?" Silence stretched between them before he finally said the words they both knew were coming. "This marriage was always a business transaction. Let's not pretend it was more than that." Her face hardened. "You bastard." He didn't flinch. "You deserve more than a man whose heart isn't in it." Her eyes flickered with rage and something else, hurt, but she was too proud to show it. With a sharp inhale, she straightened. "Fine, but don't think this won't have consequences." As she stormed out, Alexander exhaled slowly. He had just burned a bridge, but maybe it was one that needed to burn. That evening, as Natalie tucked the girls into bed, Alexander leaned against the doorway, watching. She pressed a kiss to each of their foreheads before turning and finding him there. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then, finally, she sighed. "You ended things with Isabella." It wasn't a question. He nodded. "I did." Her eyes searched his, and for the first time, he saw something besides wariness. He saw the woman he once loved, the woman he had never stopped loving. "And now?" she asked, voice barely above a whisper. He took a step closer. "Now I fight for what truly matters." And this time he wasn't going to lose. For the first time in his life, Alexander Sterling felt truly vulnerable. Not in a boardroom, not in a hostile takeover, but in the presence of two little girls who had the power to break him. That night, after Natalie tucked Chloe and Grace into bed, she found Alexander standing in the hallway, deep in thought. His usual sharp demeanor was softened, his expression unreadable. "You don't have to stand out here like a bodyguard," she said quietly. He exhaled through his nose, glancing toward the door. I don't want to miss anything else." Her gaze softened. "You can't make up for 8 years in one night, Alexander." He turned to her then, his eyes dark with emotion. "I know, but I have to start somewhere." A silence stretched between them, one heavy with unspoken words, old wounds, and something else, something that neither of them was ready to name yet. Finally, Natalie nodded. "Come downstairs. Let's talk." Seated across from each other in the dimly lit study, Alexander and Natalie nursed their drinks. His, whiskey, hers, tea. "They're warming up to you," Natalie admitted. "Chloe, maybe," he muttered. "Grace still looks at me like I'm some imposter." Natalie smiled faintly. "She's cautious. She doesn't trust easily." His jaw tightened. "She shouldn't have to. I should have been there." She studied him carefully before setting her cup down. "Why are you really doing this, Alexander?" He frowned. "What do you mean?" "You've spent your life controlling everything, building an empire, eliminating threats, making power moves. Is this about them? Or is this about you?" His throat tightened. "I don't know who I am in their world," he admitted. "I don't know how to be a father." Natalie exhaled slowly. "Then let them teach you." He met her gaze, something unspoken passing between them. For once, Alexander Sterling wasn't the one in control, and it terrified him. The next morning, Alexander was in his office reviewing contracts when Grace barged in. "You need to cancel your work," she announced. He blinked. "Excuse me? Mom said you should spend time with us today. Chloe wants to go to the art museum, but I think that's boring, so we made a deal." He leaned back in his chair, intrigued. "What kind of deal?" 1 hour at the museum, then 1 hour at the soccer field." A smirk tugged at his lips. "You two negotiated with each other?" She crossed her arms. "Well, yeah. Mom says negotiating is important." Alexander chuckled. "She's not wrong." He stood, closing his laptop. "All right, let's go." Grace's eyes flickered with surprise before she covered it with a nonchalant shrug. "Good. But don't embarrass us by wearing a suit." He let out a rare laugh. "Noted." Walking through an art museum with Chloe and kicking a soccer ball around with Grace was a world away from the ruthless boardrooms Alexander was used to. But it was surprisingly enjoyable. Chloe excitedly pointed out different paintings, explaining their meanings in ways that were far beyond her years. "And this one," she said, gesturing to a Renaissance piece, "is about sacrifice." Alexander glanced at it before turning to her. "And what do you think about sacrifice?" She thought for a moment before shrugging. "Sometimes people have to give up things to protect the ones they love." His stomach twisted. Did she mean Natalie? Did she mean him? An hour later, they were at the soccer field, where Grace wasted no time putting him to the test. "You're slow," she taunted after scoring 2 goals. "I'm pacing myself," Alexander replied dryly. "You're losing," she corrected. He narrowed his eyes playfully. "We'll see about that." By the time they left, Grace was slightly out of breath but grinning. "You're okay, I guess," she admitted. "For a businessman." It wasn't much, but to Alexander, it was everything. Later that night, after dinner, Chloe and Grace sat on the couch, whispering to each other. Natalie glanced at them. "What are you two plotting?" Chloe looked up innocently. "Can we sleep over?" Alexander froze. Grace turned to him. You do have guest rooms, right? Or is your giant house just for show? Alexander smirked. I have guest rooms. Chloe brightened. Then can we stay? Natalie hesitated. Girls, I don't… Please, Mommy, Grace pleaded. Natalie exhaled. Are you sure, Alexander? He didn't hesitate. Yes. Chloe and Grace cheered. And just like that, his house no longer felt so empty. That night, Alexander stood outside their rooms, listening. Laughter, whispers, the soft murmur of childhood innocence. Something inside him shifted. This was what he had missed, and he wasn't going to lose it again. As he turned to leave, Natalie appeared in the hallway. They stood there in silence before she said softly, You did good today. He exhaled, running a hand through his hair. I don't know what I'm doing. She smiled. You don't have to. You're learning. His chest tightened. For years, he had been untouchable. Now, 2 little girls were teaching him what it meant to feel. And for the first time in his life, Alexander Sterling wasn't afraid of it.